Hi, I'm Amy O'Donnell on behalf of Bernina World of Sewing in Raleigh and Wilmington, North Carolina. And welcome to month 4 of our Feathered Friends Quilt Along. How exciting is this? The months are flying by. Thanks to everyone that continues to send their photos every month of their work in process. And I'm just overwhelmed every time I receive one of your photos of your beautiful quilts and how they grow month by month. So this is truly an awesomely creative group of people. This month, the unique and interesting border we're going to be adding to our quilt center includes 72 3.5 by 2 inch flying geese. And so if you've not used the wing clipper ruler or you're not comfortable with it, you will be after this month because that's a lot of flying geese to make. It's chain piecing friendly, which is nice. And it's also, the cutting for this is also stripology friendly. So we always want to use our tools to make it easier for us to make these beautiful creations. I do recommend that you pace yourself on sewing and trimming. There's a lot of trimming involved, and I don't want you to wear out your arms and your shoulders doing this. So maybe make your flying geese in groups of, 12 at a time, because we make 4 at a time. So if you do 12 at a time, you'll kind of get into the groove, but don't tax yourself and injure yourself doing this, because quilting is a very physical hobby. And when I tell people this, they're like, what are you talking about? But it really is. And when you're cutting, you're sewing, you're trimming, and there's just a lot to it, a lot more than people believe. So we don't want to get any of those repetitive motion injuries. This month we're going to be using, since it's chain piecing friendly, we're going to be using our Blade Saver thread cutter a lot. We're going to be using, this is going to be your best friend, this wing clipper ruler. You're also going to need your 22-inch quilting ruler toward the end of this month's assignment. So have that handy. The other thing that's really going to be handy, if you have one, and if you don't, it's fine too, is the turning cutting board. This is so awesome to be able to especially with the flying geese, because they're trimmed on all 4 sides. So to be able to trim and turn and trim and turn is really an awesome time-saving thing to be able to do. And we're also going to need your portable design board, which is just the foam core with the batting glued on. That's going to be great for toting our flying geese around our sewing room from our cutting area to our sewing area. So let me see what else I need to tell you about. Before you start sewing any of these flying geese, I recommend that you shorten your stitch length to 2.0 or just a little less, because all these blocks are going to be trimmed and we want to make sure those stitches are super secure. So we want our quilts to last and not come unsewn with all the handling that we're going to do. You're going to need some fabric marking tools, and I would highly recommend, it's time for a new blade, ladies. Let's change the blade out in that rotary cutter so we can really trim these flying geese to size. So with that, let's get started. This month, we're going to be adding our Flying Geese border. As you can see in the picture, we're adding 8 strips of 9 flying geese, 2 strips to each side of our quilt. In addition to this, we're going to be encountering our first experience with spacing borders and spacing blocks. The cutting diagram is shown for the background fabric, shows us cutting the 2.5-inch squares and the 3.5-inch squares for our flying geese blocks. The 2-inch spacing borders are along the right side there, and if you're doing your spacing borders out of a different fabric, then this is the time when you want to cut that fabric. And we will be using our dark, our light medium, and our light to make our flying geese this month. And we want to cut 6 4.5 squares of each of those fabrics. And here's a shot of all of our fabrics when we have them cut. And here we are laying out our first flying geese. So you want to draw a diagonal line on the background fabric and line it up on one of your 4.5-inch squares as shown, and scooch it in from the edges like you can see from the top and bottom. So a 1/4 inch on each side of the diagonal lines. And then we're going to want to cut on that diagonal line once we've sewn on each side of it. And we'll want to sew a 1/4 inch on each side of the line and then trim on the line. Press the seam allowances toward the background fabric and then trim as shown. When using your Deb Tucker wing clipper, always start with the V pointed down and line it up as shown. trim the top and the side, and then turn the block and trim the top and the side once again, the other top and the other side, right? And here is our completed flying geese block. So we need to make a total of 72 of these. And the Deb Tucker method has you make 4 at a time. So like I said earlier, I suggest that you pace yourself to avoid straining your arms and shoulders with all the cutting and trimming and sewing. And here is where we can put 3 at a time down and trim 3 at a time. This shows how you can put 6 onto your turning cutting mat, and 6 might be uncomfortable for some people, so maybe just 4, but you can trim and turn and then trim, and then you'll have them, a set of 4 or a set of 6 all trimmed. Now we've got all of our flying geese pressed and trimmed and ready to assemble. Take your portable design board and lay out your strips of flying geese. We'll be making a total of 8 strips, 2 strips for each side of our quilt. Sew them together with a 1/4 inch seam, and make sure you sew from the back side of the flying geese with the point visible so you don't stitch across your point. You want your point to be crisp. That's what makes it look so great on this quilt. Just like that. So right through that point. And after you sew your flying geese together, press the seams toward the points of the flying geese. So you can just press them all in one direction. You may choose to press them open, but I pressed mine all in one direction toward the flying geese, toward the point of the flying geese. Next, I want to say a little bit about the spacer borders that we're going to be putting in. And we're going to be doing that for this flying geese block and also for the next month for the 9-patch border that we're doing. And the purpose of the spacer border is to allow us to have a visual break between the interesting borders that we're adding to this quilt, and particularly also to allow the border to stand alone and be more vibrant when you look at the quilt. The other thing you want to do with the spacer border is to give a seam heavy edge a place to rest against a edge of fabric that does not have a lot of seams in it. You don't want to butt the seams with the flying geese with all those seams up against another border with lots of seams. So it kind of has a double purpose to give it a visual rest, allow it to stand out. And also we don't have to butt all those seams up against each other and have a lot of bulk encountering each other. The instructions say, if you look at the cutting diagram for the background fabric, it says to cut your spacing borders 2 inches wide. And if you're doing this out of a contrast fabric, you will want to cut it 2 inches wide also. And then if you read further in the instructions, it says to trim down, after we sew it onto our center block of the quilt, that they want us to trim it down. And you might say, well, why can't we trim it before we apply it? And that is a very good question. And the reason for that is, once you get, depending on what you're using for your background fabric, once you get below like 1 inch or 1.5 inches, the fabric can get very wavy when you press it. You sew it on and you're pressing it, and you can end up with a very wavy edge that is not what we like to see in a quilt, in a border of a quilt. So we're going to go ahead and have you sew it on and then trim it down to size using your 22-inch ruler, and that will hopefully take any waviness out of the equation. And here we are applying the 2-inch wide strip to the stacked square blocks that we did last month. And I probably should have put some pins in it, and you can pin if you want to, but you want to sew from the stacked square side of the blocks to make sure you don't cut your points off, and to make sure those seams stay pressed the way you want them. You want to sew your spacer border onto opposite sides of your quilt. So here I've sewn it on to the sides of the quilt. And now I've sewn it onto the top and bottom of the quilt. So I've got the spacer border all sewn onto the quilt. So I'm also trimming off the edges where one bar may overhang the other bar. I'm just showing that you need to nip those little things off and make sure that your edges are all even where they come together on the side and the top and the bottom. And now it's time to trim the spacer border down to size. And you can see there that I'm trimming off 1.25 inches, which is what the instructions say to trim off. I want to say a little bit more about the spacer border. I personally do not like to have a really tiny border when I'm sewing up against a seam that I've already sewn. I have a hard time keeping it straight on my machine, and it just makes me very nervous. I mean, it's like just a thing that I've got. So I did not trim. I gave myself some extra space on my spacer bar. So instead of trimming it to, what does she say? To trim to 3/4 inch. I think I trimmed mine to 1.25 inches. So I think I gave myself an extra little oomph there to give me a chance not to have to stitch so close to the seam of the previous border. So you can do whatever you want to do. It's a matter of personal preference, but I just wanted to tell you that that's what I did personally. And so don't feel bad. This is our hobby. We can make it however we want to make it. I would not recommend leaving the spacer bar the full 2 inches or anything more than what I did, because it can throw off the feng shui of the rest of the blocks and how they're going to fit into the quilt. So you don't want to throw that off, because these blocks are precisely sized. And we do have a little bit of play with our spacer blocks, but we don't want to push the limit. So we want our blocks to fit on there properly. So if you feel like you need an extra 1/4 or 1/2 inch, do it. You're doing it at your own risk, like I did. And my gamble turned out fine. And I hope that yours will too, if you decide to do that. But I just wanted to put that little caveat in there. I actually trimmed off 3/4 inch off of my quilt. So I gave myself a little more room on that spacer. So I sewed on the 2 inch and then I trimmed off 3/4 inch. And here's how I measured my center. My center was 32 inches and I'm supposed to trim it to 29.5, which means that I needed to trim off 2.5 inches, and 2.5 divided by 2 is 1.25 inches. So you figure out how much you need to trim to. And here's an example of how I just lined up my flying geese on my design wall just to see how they're going to look. I'm a visual person. I like to see how something's going to look as much as I can before I do it. And so that's what I've done here. So I added my center block, and these are not up here precisely or anything like that. And this is before I trimmed my, my strip, but I've got it up here just to see how it's going to look, just so we can visualize it. And there are my flying geese. Now I want to say a few words about the spacing blocks. And the purpose of the spacing blocks is to right size our quilt. We all sew differently, and there's nothing wrong with that. And but we want to make sure the quilt is as close to the right size as it can be, so that our subsequent borders with these various interesting blocks will fit around the quilt center. So it's going to involve a little math, which I'm going to walk you through. And in the written instructions, there's a great example provided by Sonia about how to calculate the width of your spacer bar. Everyone sews differently. We all have different brands of machine, different kinds of feet, and so on. If we wanted cookie cutter, we'd go to Kohl's and buy a quilt, right? These are not going to be cookie cutter. They're not going to be precisely sized. They're going to be our own creations. We're all individuals, and one person's 1/4 inch is not the same as another. So keep that in mind as we go about doing these spacer blocks. Okay. Let's talk about calculating the width of the spacer bar. I would like for you to measure the center of your quilt after you have attached and trimmed your spacing border. Measure from edge to edge. It should be in the 29.5 inch range, okay, plus or minus 1/2 inch. And we will call this X. Next, you want to measure the length of your sewn together flying geese strips from edge to edge, including the seam allowances. These should be in the 14 inch range, and we're going to call that measurement Y. Okay, so we've got X is the center of your quilt after you've attached your spacing border, and before you, or after you've attached it and trimmed it, and Y is the length of your flying geese strips from edge to edge. The goal is to have the spacer bar centered over this center stacked square unit. You want that spacer bar to be centered over that unit. So that is our goal here. And so let's keep that in mind. That's the ultimate goal. Everyone's quilt is not going to measure the same. So let's use the example that I gave you, and we'll show this on a slide too. So if you take X, which is the width of your center, after you have attached and trimmed your spacing border, and you subtract 2 times Y, because you're going to have 2 blocks of flying geese per side of your quilt, okay? 2 times Y minus the 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then plus a 1/2 inch seam allowance is going to give you the width of your spacer bar. So if you do that calculation, as you can see on the screen, you should have an accurate number for what your spacer bar should be, including the seam allowance. I'm sure this is confusing to you, and I think that you need to sit down and review the PDF instructions and listen to this video again and make sure you understand it before you cut. We don't want to make any erroneous cutting errors or anything like that at this stage of the game. Now, we're going to be doing these spacer bars again next month, so you want to make sure that you understand it, and so this is a good warm-up for you, right? Yeah, I can see you nodding. I see that you're into it. Okay, all right. You can see we have inserted our spacer bar into our flying geese block. And I've turned it over, and you can see I pressed the seam toward the center. And now it's time to sew the flying geese border onto one side of our quilt. And I'm pinning, pinning, pinning. And if you notice, those seams are all pressed toward the point of the flying geese. Lots of pins, and we may have to ease it just a little bit. We're sewing it on, being careful to maintain that 1/4 inch seam allowance. And we sewed on 2 sides first, and then the last 2 sides that we sewn on, we put the corner blocks on. And this is what we have, our finished flying geese blocks attached to our center. I hope everybody enjoyed the video, and next month we're going to be doing the 9 patch. So get ready, and it's going to be lots of fun. Have a great month, everybody. Keep those pictures coming.